The darkest dungeons of medieval times, where prisoners vanished into eternal darkness. Welcome, dear viewers, to Tales Labyrinth, where we illuminate the darkest corners of human history and bring forgotten stories back from the shadows of time. Today, we embark on a terrifying journey into the underground dungeons of medieval Europe, descending into subterranean chambers where light itself feared to enter and hope died upon arrival. These were the pits of oblivion where prisoners vanished from the world above, consigned to slow death in conditions designed to destroy both body and soul through calculated cruelty. Before we venture into these depths of despair, please support our Tales Labyrinth channel by pressing the like button and subscribing to join our community of history explorers who dare to confront the uncomfortable truths of our past. Stay with us until the very end of this harrowing tale, for the horrors we reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval justice and human suffering. First, descent into the abyss. The stone stairway carved into bedrock spiraled downward in a dizzying pattern, each worn step testament to countless condemned souls who had made this final journey before. Rough-hewn walls glistened with perpetual moisture that seeped through cracks in ancient masonry, creating an atmosphere of suffocating dampness that penetrated clothing and chilled bones instantly. Guards in chainmail hauberks and leather tunics gripped iron shackles attached to prisoners' wrists, dragging them deeper into the earth with rough efficiency born from years of practice. Flickering torches mounted in wrought iron brackets cast dancing shadows across the descending passage, their orange flames struggling against overwhelming darkness that seemed determined to swallow all light. Medieval castles throughout Europe concealed these subterranean nightmares beneath their grand halls, where nobles feasted and minstrels sang, hiding shameful secrets beneath layers of stone and packed earth. Lords commissioned master masons to construct these underground labyrinths during castle construction, ensuring permanent facilities for disposing of enemies, traitors, and those who threatened established power structures. The air grew progressively colder and fouler with each descending level, carrying the unmistakable stench of human waste, rotting straw, and decomposing flesh that announced approaching horrors. Prisoners marked for the deepest cells recognized these odors with mounting terror, understanding they descended toward places where sunlight had never penetrated since stones were first laid. Water dripped constantly from vaulted ceilings overhead, the rhythmic sound echoing through passages in maddening repetition that would become the only time measurement for imprisoned souls below. Puddles collected in depressions worn into stone floors over centuries, never evaporating in the perpetually damp underground environment that bred disease and accelerated human deterioration. Rats the size of small cats scurried boldly through shadows cast by torch flames, their eyes reflecting light with an eerie red glow that made them appear demonic. These creatures had thrived for generations in the dungeons, growing fat on scraps thrown to prisoners and occasionally feeding on captives too weak to defend themselves. The psychological impact of descent proved as devastating as any physical torture that would follow, each downward step taking prisoners further from everything familiar and human. Many wept openly during this journey, their pleas for mercy echoing through stone corridors before being absorbed by oppressive silence that swallowed all hope and reduced grown warriors to whimpering children. Second, chambers of forgotten souls, heavy oak doors reinforced with iron bands, groaned open on corroded hinges, revealing cells so cramped that standing upright became impossible for anyone of normal adult height. These stone chambers measured barely 6 feet in length and width, with ceilings so low they forced prisoners into permanent crouches that deformed spines and crippled legs. Darkness inside these spaces was absolute and suffocating, a tangible presence that pressed against eyeballs and invaded lungs with every labored breath taken in stagnant air. Prisoners lost all sense of time within hours of confinement, unable to distinguish between day and night, waking and sleeping, reality and nightmare in this perpetual blackness. The silence proved even more maddening than darkness, broken only by distant water drips and occasional rat squeaks that made prisoners startle violently despite exhaustion and weakness. Guards rarely spoke to condemned souls, treating them as already dead and unworthy of human interaction, their footsteps passing cell doors without acknowledgement of the suffering within. Stone walls wept constant moisture that soaked through woolen tunics and linen undergarments, creating permanent dampness that never dried despite body heat radiating from huddled forms pressed against cold surfaces. This wetness bred black mold and green fungus that coated every surface with slick growth, filling confined spaces with spores that infected lungs and caused bloody coughing. Food arrived sporadically through small openings at floor level, consisting of moldy bread crusts, rancid porridge, and brackish water that often contained insect fragments and rat droppings floating on its surface. Prisoners learned to eat in complete darkness, unable to see what they consumed, sometimes discovering too late that rats had contaminated their meager sustenance or stolen it entirely. Waste accumulated in corners that prisoners designated by feel alone, as no chamber pots or drainage systems existed in cells designed for slow death rather than sustained habitation. The overwhelming stench became so familiar that prisoners ceased noticing it within days, their senses deadened by constant assault from every direction simultaneously and without respite. Years could pass in these forgotten chambers, with prisoners losing all sense of personal identity, forgetting their own names and the accusations that had condemned them to this living death. Some scratched marks on walls with fingernails or broken stones to count days, but darkness rendered this impossible. And eventually, even the desperate impulse to measure time's passage faded into apathetic acceptance of eternal present suffering without beginning or end. Third, the oubliettes' terrible design. The most ingenious and terrifying dungeon design ever conceived by medieval architects was the oubliette, a vertical shaft accessed only from above through a trapdoor in castle floors. Its very name derived from the French verb oublier, meaning to forget, perfectly describing its horrific purpose of erasing prisoners from existence and human memory as completely as death itself. Victims were dropped through narrow circular openings barely wide enough for human bodies to pass, falling into bottle-shaped chambers that widened dramatically below the entrance point, making any climbing attempt utterly futile. The fall itself frequently broke legs, arms, and ribs, leaving prisoners crippled and in agony at the bottom of pits where no medical assistance would ever arrive. These vertical shafts descended 20 to 40 feet into solid bedrock beneath castle foundations, placing prisoners in spaces that predated the fortifications built above them by centuries. Some oubliettes incorporated natural cave formations discovered during construction, while others were laboriously chiseled from living stone by teams of masons specifically to create these human disposal units. Light never penetrated these depths except during brief moments when trapdoors opened to deposit new victims or occasionally drop stale bread and water down to the imprisoned below. Prisoners learned to recognize the sound of iron hinges creaking far above their heads, signaling either sustenance descending or the arrival of companions to share their lightless tomb. The curved walls of bottle-shaped chambers prevented any possibility of climbing, their smooth surfaces worn slick by underground water and offering no handholds or footholds for desperate fingers seeking escape. Prisoners who attempted climbing inevitably fell back to the floor, sometimes repeatedly injuring themselves in futile efforts that only hastened their physical deterioration and deepened their psychological despair. Bodies of previous occupants often remained in these pits for months or years, their decomposing remains providing grim evidence to new arrivals about the inevitable fate awaiting them in darkness. Some prisoners, driven mad by starvation, consumed the flesh of the dead, committing acts that would have been unthinkable in their previous lives, but became desperate survival measures. The psychological torture of the oubliette exceeded even its considerable physical horrors, as prisoners knew with absolute certainty they had been deliberately forgotten by the world above. No legal appeals would revisit their cases, no pardons would descend from merciful lords, no rescue would arrive because the living world had already erased them from consciousness and memory as thoroughly as if they had never existed at all. Fourth, madness, born in darkness. Extended isolation in absolute darkness inevitably destroyed human minds, transforming rational beings into creatures of pure instinct and primal fear, operating without conscious thought or coherent understanding. Prisoners began experiencing vivid hallucinations within the first weeks of confinement, seeing phantom lights dancing in blackness and hearing voices whispering incomprehensible messages from empty corners of their cells. Some captives developed elaborate conversations with imaginary companions, creating detailed relationships with spirits or demons they believed inhabited the darkness surrounding them on all sides, without relief. These delusions initially provided comfort and maintained some connection to human interaction, but inevitably turned malevolent as friendly voices became accusatory and threatening, driving prisoners deeper into psychological labyrinths. Temporal disorientation became complete as natural circadian rhythms collapsed without any light cycles to anchor biological processes to external reality's progression and the normal passage of hours. Prisoners could no longer distinguish between minutes and hours, days and weeks, sleeping and waking, until existence became one endless present moment of undifferentiated suffering without past or future. Physical deterioration accompanied mental collapse as muscles atrophied from disuse and chronic malnutrition. Reduced bodies to skeletal frames covered in festering sores and infected wounds that never healed properly. Eyesight suffered permanent damage from prolonged darkness, leaving prisoners functionally blind even if they ever emerged into light, their pupils unable to contract after years of complete darkness. Some prisoners engaged in self-mutilation, scratching at their own flesh with broken fingernails until blood flowed freely, simply to feel something real and confirm continued existence through physical pain. Others pulled out their own hair strand by strand in nervous compulsion, or ground their teeth down to broken stumps through constant unconscious grinding that continued during fitful sleep. The urge to scream consumed many captives, but their voices grew hoarse and failed after hours of shrieking into darkness that absorbed all sound without echo or response. Eventually, throats became too damaged for vocalization, reducing prisoners to wheezing rasps when attempting to speak or cry out for help that would never come from the indifferent world. Religious faith either intensified or completely shattered under such extreme conditions, with some prisoners praying constantly in desperate hope, while others cursed God and embraced darkness as their new deity. Many developed elaborate theological frameworks to explain their suffering, constructing meaning from meaninglessness to preserve some fragment of sanity in the face of utter abandonment by both humanity and heaven itself. Fifth, ghosts that haunt the depths. Even after death finally released prisoners from their underground torment, local legends claimed their tormented spirits remained trapped in the very cells where they had perished over months or years. Castle guards reported hearing anguished wails emanating from sealed dungeons late at night, cries that seemed to emerge from stone itself rather than any identifiable living source or natural explanation. Monks assigned to perform religious duties in castle chapels swore they felt invisible hands grasping desperately at their woolen robes when passing certain dungeon entrances, pulling them toward darkness with surprising strength. These holy men conducted elaborate exorcisms and blessed the cursed spaces with holy water, but supernatural disturbances continued unabated, suggesting whatever dwelt below possessed power beyond the church's authority. Some castle inhabitants claimed to witness shadowy figures ascending from lower levels during the darkest hours before dawn. Spectral forms that drifted through locked oak doors as if solid barriers held no meaning. These apparitions bore expressions of infinite suffering frozen on translucent faces, their hollow eyes reflecting torments endured during years of living death in underground cells beneath castle foundations where they had been forgotten. Workers renovating ancient fortifications sometimes discovered forgotten dungeons that had been sealed for centuries, their grim contents revealing the full horror of medieval imprisonment practices to shocked modern eyes. Skeletal remains lay in positions suggesting final agonies, hands clawing at walls, fingers worn to bone stumps from desperate scratching at unyielding stone surfaces that never yielded to their futile efforts. Objects found in these sealed cells told stories of profound suffering and desperate hope that never materialized into salvation or relief from endless torment and slow death. Scratched messages in Latin, French, and various dialects covered walls, final testaments from prisoners who knew their words would likely never be read by living eyes, but wrote them anyway. Modern paranormal investigators who explore preserved medieval dungeons report overwhelming sensations of dread and oppression when entering these spaces, their electronic equipment registering unexplained temperature drops and electromagnetic anomalies without natural cause. Photographs taken in these locations often reveal strange mists and shadow figures that weren't visible to naked eyes during the actual moment of capture, suggesting residual energies linger. The deepest dungeons in many castles remain deliberately sealed today, their entrances blocked by successive generations who feared disturbing whatever dwelt in those lightless depths below ancient foundations. Local legends warn against opening these forgotten cells, claiming the accumulated suffering of centuries has created malevolent presences that should never be released into the world above, where innocent souls dwell in peaceful ignorance of the horrors that lurk beneath their very feet in eternal darkness and absolute silence. The underground dungeons of medieval Europe stand as permanent monuments to humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty and systematic dehumanization on scales that challenge modern comprehension and moral sensibilities. These pits of oblivion consumed thousands of souls across centuries, leaving behind only scattered bones, persistent legends, and lingering darkness that still haunts ancient castles throughout the continent, where tourists walk unknowingly above sealed chambers of unspeakable suffering. If this journey into the depths of medieval horror has moved you, please show your support for Tales Labyrinth by pressing the like button, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to our channel to continue exploring history's darkest chapters together. Join us next week as Tales Labyrinth ventures into the torture chambers, where inquisitors extracted confessions and executioners perfected the art of prolonged suffering in the name of justice and religious orthodoxy. Until then, dear viewers, remember that understanding our past's darkest moments helps us appreciate the light of our present and remain vigilant against shadows that still threaten to return.